From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, this is From the South, and I am Sweeney Gray. And a very special welcome to our viewers in Grenada who are joining us on WPG 10. The new Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, has presented her government's first budget, and it stands firm on a number of her campaign promises to improve services. Mottley spent over 2 hours delivering her budget speech to Parliament. Last week, the IMF urged Barbados to cut public spending, including pensions, in order to address its burgeoning debt and deficit. Mottley promised to return the country's finances to a surplus by March of next year, but she says she will do this while protecting social spending.
So, sir, our nation stands on the brink of its biggest battle that we've had to face in our 52 years. And as I said, if we shy away from this battle now, our debt, sir, will devour us. Today, servicing our debt consumes more money than the entire central government wage bill. I want to repeat myself. Servicing Barbados's debt, our interest bill, consumes more than the entire central government wage bill.
So let's take a look at some of the promises that Prime Minister Mottley says she plans to keep, according to the budget. Students at the University of the West Indies will pay no tuition from September this year. Old age pensions will be increased from US 78 to US 113. Corporation tax will raise from 25% to 30%, and income tax on earnings over $38,000 will go up to 40%. And all public sector workers will get a wage increase of 5% from 1st of April of this year to the end of March 2019. Rejection is mounting in Argentina against the agreement that the government of Mauricio Macri signed with the IMF. Truck drivers have called for a general strike.
Turning to the International Monetary Fund means deepening the neoliberal policies of the Cambiemos government. The conditions attached to the agreement sharpen those policies of adjustment even further. Utility prices will continue to rise. Layoffs in the public sector will also increase, and workers' real wages will fall.
The Monetary Fund proposes a kind of double austerity in terms of infrastructure, which directly hits the construction companies, which have been a major pillar of support for Macri. And on the other hand, they demand a cut in spending that will make people poor and slash their purchasing power, to an extent that the Argentinian people are not willing to accept.
In the middle of Argentina's economic crisis, the credit line of $50 billion begins with a tranche of $15 billion. Subject to compliance with the program demanded by the fund. From now on, the economic adjustment will be under the control of experts from the International Monetary Fund.
This is the return of the International Monetary Fund that led Argentina into a terminal crisis in 2001. This is a movie we have already seen, and now, step by step, we are seeing exactly the same sequence of events as in the 1990s. The International Monetary Fund demands cuts in public spending, and for the government, that means cuts in health and education.
The powerful truckers' union has confirmed that if they don't get an increase of 27%, they will begin a complete stoppage from Thursday, alongside the CTA Union Federation. And they are urging the Federal Confederation of Labor, the CGT, to join them and make it a general strike.
We have a meeting today, and the bosses said that they cannot pay 27%. We will go to a hearing tomorrow, but we have already ratified Thursday's strike.
In exchange for the International Monetary Fund support, Argentina must take severe adjustments of more than $19 billion that will include budget cuts to pensions, public works, and subsidies. As discontent grows, the unions expect the protests to increase even more in the coming days.
And Ecuador has begun making approaches to the International Monetary Fund. The Ecuadorian Economy Minister Richard Martinez is in Washington with a team of government officials. They held meetings with the IMF's Director for Latin America, as well as with the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. Ecuador's relations with the IMF were strained during the previous administration of Rafael Correa. And Rafael Correa has reacted angrily to reports that Ecuador's Attorney General is trying to link him to an attempted kidnapping in Colombia. Correa tweeted, "This is all-out lawfare, since they can never prove corruption. Now they're trying to link me, with no proof at all, to a supposed attempt to kidnap a fugitive from justice in Colombia in 2012. What a precedent they are setting." And to Brazil now, where electricity workers have begun a 3-day strike against the privatization of Eletrobras, the state energy company. Eletrobras is Latin America's biggest power utility company and operates the huge hydroelectric plant at Itaipu. Last year, President Michel Temer proposed selling it off.
Here in Brazil, a 72-hour strike is underway, organized by unions and confederations of the electricity sector. This strike is against the privatization of Eletrobras, one of the major projects of the governments of Michel Temer. The objective is to sell the company to help cover the public deficit. This privatization is subject to some of the legislation going through Congress, and which workers have been protesting against. Workers say that if the company is privatized, energy bills will rise, and many people will be affected. This strike will last until Wednesday, and the workers say that the essential services will be maintained. The unions also want the removal of the president of the company, Wilson Ferreira Jr. Those are the main demands of this strike, which comes at a time when the government of Michel Temer is facing a record low on its popularity. According to a recent poll by Datafolia, only 3% approve of his administration. And most Brazilians do not agree with this drive towards privatization that his government is promoting. That is why the electricity workers are being supported in the strike by other organizations and movements, like the Landless Movement and the Movement of the Victim of Dams. They are all against this privatization of Eletrobras that is being promoted by Temer's government.
In Mexico, Tropical Storm Bud has now turned into a Category 1 hurricane and can turn into a Category 2 in the coming hours. This means strong winds could cause extensive damage. Bud has caused heavy rains and winds of up to 150 kilometers per hour and strong tides on the Mexican coast. The states of Michoacán, Colima and Guerrero were mostly affected. In Jalisco, the electric train service was affected. The highest category of hurricanes on the Saffir-Simpson scale is Category 5. And 1 week after the eruption of the Fuego volcano in Guatemala, victims are still waiting for a concrete response from the government. Our correspondent, Mario Rosales, has the latest from Guatemala City.
The emergency continues after the eruption of the Fuego volcano. It's been 1 week since the disaster, and the government does not have concrete data on how many people died or have disappeared. They maintain a pretty conservative and minuscule figure. According to people and social and civic organizations working in the Escuintla region, it's a very difficult situation for the victims because the government is not providing accurate data on the number of disappeared individuals, victims, and especially how they will come up with an emergency plan for the victims and their housing. The situation in the shelters is causing concern after a man was arrested after trying to sexually assault an 11-year-old girl. That happened in one of the shelters in Escuintla. Organizations will be demonstrating outside Congress in Guatemala's capital to demand the immediate and effective help for the victims of the eruption.
In Guatemala's Jalapa department, a human rights activist has been murdered. He was the 7th victim in a single month. The Campesino Development Committee has called for a peaceful protest on June 12th to demand the imprisonment of those responsible for the murders.
The Campesino organizations are mourning again. They have buried 68-year-old human rights activist Francisco Munguia, who was killed in the Visadero village in the Jalapa department.
A month ago, our martyr and friend Luis Marroquín was killed. We must also remember our friend from Cobán who was also murdered.
His relatives told us that the activist was killed with a machete when he was going back to work in his little garden.
It wasn't a street fight. They went for him directly. He couldn't defend himself.
Francisco Munguia was part of the indigenous community of Cinca from the Salapan territory. He was part of the Campesino Development Committee, Codeca.
He was like a brother to me. He was the president of the committee. We used to work together, hang out together. He was a humble man.
The Cinca people in the region reject mining and demand the nationalization of electricity. Their struggle has upset the oligarchy.
We will fight for our rights. They are afraid of losing power, so they treat us like slaves, keeps us on our knees, they exploit and discriminate us.
The murder of Francisco Munguia took place only a few hours after the committee called for a peaceful protest in the capital city. The members of Codeca will take to the streets of Guatemala City on June 12th to demand justice and to investigate the murders of other human rights activists.
We'll take a short break now, but join us again after this look at what our multimedia colleagues are reporting. Welcome back. The presidential race in Colombia is growing more intense as some polls show the left-wing candidate, Gustavo Petro, closing the gap on the front-runner, Iván Duque. According to the Latin American Strategic Center of Geopolitics, CELAG, the right-wing candidate's lead is down to just 5.5%. It puts Iván Duque on 45.5% and Gustavo Petro on 40%. The survey was done before Antanas Mucas and Claudia Lopez from the Green Party announced their support for the left-wing candidate. Other polls still give Duque a lead of between 10 and 20 points. And as Colombians prepare for the second round of elections, let's take a look at the issue of public safety in the country.
As Colombia's presidential runoff draws closer, social movements remember the serious human rights violations that were committed under past governments.
Young people who were taken with false promises of work, and then they show up as killed in combat.
They also remember that between 2002 and 2010, more than 10,000 extrajudicial executions were reported.
It was within the framework of the so-called democratic security that there were widespread arbitrary detentions and extrajudicial executions. There were orders straight from the Defense Ministry and obviously the presidency.
Serious human rights violations were added to these state crimes.
During Uribe's time, there were more than 1,000 attacks on human rights activists, going from threats to murders.
Another criticism made of Uribe's government was the increase in paramilitary activity.
When Uribe was the governor of Antioquia, paramilitary groups grew dramatically. In the end, there were more than 100 of them.
Now, many former members of Uribe's cabinet are being investigated for their links to paramilitary groups.
Mayor Santoyo, Uribe's head of security, is now in jail in the United States. And not only for drug trafficking, but also for his active collaboration with paramilitary groups. And like him, we could also mention many of his ministers and senators and others close to former President Uribe.
Campesinos, indigenous people, and social leaders are concerned not only that Álvaro Uribe Vélez is behind the candidacy of Iván Duque, but also the endorsement of corrupt political groups.
Duque has brought together the traditional political class, and the most corrupt parties are not ashamed or publicly expressing their support for him. Duque has said publicly that he will intercede directly in the judicial process, and that he intends to eliminate the high courts.
Social movements and human rights activists hope the new president of Colombia will fight to prevent the violence from getting worse.
The worst thing that the country can do is to return to paramilitary groups taking over Colombia.
A week ago, the Supreme Court of Justice declared the massacres of San Roque, El Haro, and La Granja as crimes against humanity. Crimes in which Álvaro Uribe, who was then governor of Antioquia, is facing a preliminary investigation.
And ahead of the election on Sunday, the National Liberation Army, or ELN, has announced a ceasefire for the coming weekend. In a statement, the country's largest remaining guerrilla group said the truce will facilitate the participation of Colombians in the second round of the presidential election. The ceasefire starts on Friday and will end on Tuesday, June 19th. Talks between the Colombian government and the armed group are seeking to establish a new bilateral ceasefire. And 3 more people have been killed in Nicaragua over the weekend as violence continued between opposition groups, the police, and government supporters. The opposition set up more barricades and fired homemade mortars at the security forces. 2 of the victims died during confrontations in Managua and the northern city of Jinotega. The 3rd victim was a man in his 60s who died after a bullet struck his heart in the city of Masaya. The former Panamanian president, Ricardo Martinelli, has been extradited from the United States to Panama. Martinelli was transferred from a federal prison in Miami. The former president is accused of ordering that over 150 people, including journalists and politicians, be spied upon. The former president is also under investigation for 20 other cases of corruption, not referred to in the extradition request. The state attorney's office in Peru is investigating 3 former presidents for allegedly receiving illegal donations for their campaigns. Authorities are looking into Alan Garcia, Alejandro Toledo, and Pedro Pablo Kaczynski for allegedly receiving money from the Brazilian construction company Odebrecht. They have reported that Garcia received $200,000, Toledo $700,000, and Pedro Pablo Kaczynski, who resigned because of corruption allegations, $300,000. Pope Francis has accepted the resignations of 3 Chilean bishops following sex abuse scandals. It included Bishop Juan Barrios of Osorno, the city at the center of the uproar, the Vatican said on Monday. In an unprecedented move last month, all of Chile's 34 bishops offered to resign en masse after attending a meeting with the Pope over allegations of a cover-up of sexual abuse within the Chilean church. Thousands of Puerto Ricans rallied on Sunday in favor of independence and the decolonization of the island. Protesters in the capital city, San Juan, also criticized the austerity measures of Governor Ricardo Rosselló and the lack of basic services, such as water and electricity, that still affects thousands of people since Hurricane Maria. Demonstrators also asked the government to stop the current privatization process of these services. The pro-independence leader, Oscar Lopez Rivera, called on Puerto Ricans to start building a new and free nation. And with more on that story, here's our U.S. correspondent, Jorge Gestoso.
The Puerto Rico Day Parade was muted by protests because of the Hurricane Maria. Many flags, black and gray, were displaced in protest because of the poor response of the U.S. government. Many of the attendants were wearing black t-shirts. Black t-shirts wearing the number 4,645. That is a death toll that are reporting that it happened with the passage of Hurricane Maria. Against 64 dead. That is the official number that the government is still reporting. Most definitely, even the governor of New York, Governor Cuomo, was protesting against that and said that was a display and another proof of the racism and discrimination that President Trump against Puerto Rican and against Hispanics.
We're going to take another short break, but join us again after another look at what our multimedia colleagues are reporting. Welcome back. Diplomats from the United States and North Korea have been meeting ahead of a landmark summit between their leaders, President Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un in Singapore on Tuesday. Both sides are trying to minimize the differences before the two leaders sit down together to discuss the substantial issues of normalizing their relations. The United States says it wants to complete denuclearization of North Korea, while for Kim, the main concern is whether the U.S. would really end its hostile policy and guarantee the security of his government if the country gets rid of its nuclear program. The presidents of Russia and Kazakhstan have promised to implement fully the Iran nuclear code during a meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in China. Russian President Vladimir Putin and Kazakh President Nursultan Nazarbayev said they are fully committed to the implementation of the nuclear deal, officially known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The JCPOA was signed in 2015 between Iran, the permanent members of the UN Security Council, Germany, and the European Union. But the plan ran into difficult waters after US President Donald Trump withdrew from it, triggering widespread opposition among the signatories.
Of course, our country cannot be but worried about the Iran nuclear program. The U.S. withdrawal from the Comprehensive Plan of Action can further destabilize the situation. Russia is in favor of consistent and unconditional implementation of JCPOA.
The United Nations Refugee Agency has welcomed Spain's decision to allow a stranded migrant boat to disembark in Valencia after Italy and Malta refused it entry. Charlie Yaxley, a spokesman for the UNHCR, said that lives have been saved by Spain as food and water supplies on board were running low. Among the migrants are pregnant women and children.
Well, the most important thing here is that lives have been saved. When we had the situation we had where provisions were rapidly running low, meant that while discussions were ongoing about where the boat could disembark, the prospect of these people surviving was becoming slimmer and slimmer. What needs to happen is that the humanitarian imperative needs to come first. Political discussions about who has responsibility for which region and in which context, they can come later.
Russia is to open a fan house for the Mexican national football team in Moscow in a bid to build cultural bridges between the two countries. As anticipation for the FIFA World Cup heats up, the fan house will accommodate fans and guests from all over the world. It will have several screens, with a very large one to show matches. The gesture has been well received by Mexico, who say they believe in bridges and not walls. And we've come to the end of this news brief. For these and many other stories, you can find them on our website at talisioTV.net/English. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Talisio English, I'm Sunny Gray. Thank you so much for watching.
June 17th, Colombia is heading to a run of votes to elect its head of state. The Colombian people have been summoned once again to cast their ballots in a determining event for the South American nation. Telesur brings you the latest news about this election.